Hi, everybody. Welcome to our session today on health movements and power building, which is part of the Law and Political Economy and GHJP Global Health Justice Partnership series that we're running on the politics of care over the past year in the fall, and now this semester, it's spring semester here at Yale. Just a quick word about the genesis of all this. Amy Kopczynski and I, Amy, who's a professor at the law school, I'm at the public health school, started thinking about the politics of care back at the beginning of this pandemic. And one of the things we realized is that there's a deep history that informs the politics of care in the United States and around the world. And that as non-historians, we needed to delve into that record of the past to figure out where we'll be in the near future and the future far ahead in our country. So today we're going to talk about the history and the legacy and the promise of health movements in terms of power building and fighting for the right to health, looking through the lens of a couple of predominant health movements of the 1960s and 70s, the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, and the Grey Panthers, but just as a departure for a larger conversation about what do we do now. I'm going to introduce our speakers very quickly, and then I'm going to give them each about 5 to 7 minutes to make some opening remarks. I'll pose a couple of questions, but I can see already that there'll be plenty of comments and questions in the Q&A in the side. I'm going to keep the introduction brief. If you want to know more about our speakers, the invitation that Corinne from the Law and Political Economy Project sent out, and I sent out in other places, links to their formal bios at their institutions. Johanna Fernandez is a historian at Baruch College, and she's the author of the Young Lords, A Radical History, which has won many awards, and I've been reading it over the past week, and it's eye-opening in many, many different ways. She's also the host of A New Day on WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City, and a well-known abolitionist. Lucie White is the Lewis Horowitz Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and she worked for 2 decades on U.S. social welfare law, but also pivoted to working on issues of extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa for a long time. She's written a lot about everyday life, law, and social movements among marginalized groups, particularly those with histories of race subordination, enslavement, and colonization. And finally, Maya Sandler is a doctoral candidate in the history of science and medicine here at Yale. She studies the histories of medicine, caregiving, and bureaucracy in the 20th century United States. Her dissertation explores the efforts of health activists to shape safety net healthcare programs and policies from the 1960s to the 1990s. And so what I'll do is open it up to Johanna, then Lucie, then Maya, just to sort of orient ourselves through your work and the work of the groups that you're most familiar with, both addressing some of the questions that Corinne had sent to us, but also to frame the conversation for today's hour and a half. So Johanna, do you want to jump in? Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm on mute. It happens every time. After 2 or 3 years already of this online thing. Okay, so I was asked, or we were all asked to talk about why these groups of the 60s, the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, the Grey Panthers, why health? And that was a question that I was really preoccupied with. I'd been writing about the Young Lords for some time, and that was what really interested me. So I set out to answer this question in my book, chapter 5 in particular. And what I discovered was that this was a sicker population because there were massive demographic shifts and economic changes in the post-war period that created a health crisis of epic proportion in urban centers. So we know the story of migration of the post-war period. Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, Black Americans, Native Americans move from countryside to city. There's an explosion of people of color in urban centers and an out-migration of working class white folks to the suburbs. And this produces a tax base erosion. But guess who else leaves the city? Mom and pop doctors. So in East Harlem, where the Young Lords were active, I found out that 1/3 of the doctors left the neighborhood to the suburbs. And because there was a transformation in in the health industry, they proceeded to engage in medical care that didn't necessarily address the mom and pop issues of the neighborhood. This was also a moment of mass displacement, not just demographic, but also in terms of housing. Urban renewal displaced people on a mass scale. I live in New York City. The place where Lincoln Center is housed now was a Puerto Rican neighborhood, and 22,000 Puerto Rican families were displaced to build this $1 million arts center. This was all under the auspices of urban renewal. So it was kind of the gentrification of the post-war period. Then there was deindustrialization. People were being displaced economically. This is the moment that produces permanent unemployment in the city for the first time in the history of urban life. And I just want to read a quote by Mindy Fullilove, who essentially tells us that that displacement is akin to root shock. And before I read the quote, I'll say that independently of the health crises produced by racism, which is a study in and of itself, the population of urban centers was experiencing this vast, unprecedented displacement on many different levels. And this produces an exponential increase in visits, for example, to hospitals. The higher incidence of sickness as a consequence of displacement, she calls root shock. And this is what she says. I'm looking for that quote. Here it is. Root shock, she explains, undermines trust, increases anxiety, destabilizes relationships, destroys social, emotional, and financial resources, and increases the risk of every kind of stress-related disease, from depression to heart attack. In addition to these structural changes, what we have in the 1960s for the first time is the availability of healthcare for poor people through Medicaid. This means that poor people of color can go to hospitals for the first time and get care. So what is going on in part is that this greater contact between poor people of color and an unreconstructed medical profession is producing medical discrimination of epic proportion, just an increase of it, because there's just more contact. And the Young Lords and the Black Panthers turned their attention to these issues because they were ever present. There was, and I'm going to end in a minute, there was a poll in East Harlem about the issues, 1968. What are the issues confronting the community? And the community said health, police brutality, and something else. I can't remember what it was, but health was at the top of the list. In the case of the Young Lords grew up bilingual as cultural and language interpreters for their parents. They helped essentially with the settlement of Puerto Ricans in cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, literally as language translators in schools, hospitals, and police departments. And as children, they were able to witness this discrimination. They perceived that people of color were perceived differently and treated without dignity at a moment when people are most vulnerable, when they are ill. And these issues combined produced an early radicalization, I think, for young people that then blossomed when they joined organizations like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers.
Thanks, Johanna. Lucie, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I will. As Johanna was talking, I couldn't help but remember, I'll be brief. I was working in the early 1980s in a housing development in South Central LA in a Head Start program. Medicaid was supposed to be available. The full panoply of preventive care was supposed to be available. The kids there had such bad, basically scarring in their ears from not having had care of ear infections that they couldn't learn to read. And they couldn't get dental appointments, even though they were paid for, because white doctors that they could be taken to wouldn't be willing to look in their mouths. That to me just illustrates one of the realities that I think came with the folks who migrated into these urban areas, mostly from the urban South, and which was already there, which was the vicious racism that they were confronted with in an everyday way. They weren't just confronted by health deserts and the inadequacy of facilities, but in every encounter with the health system, they were confronted by this very deep racist, not systemic racism that was manifested in both how individuals treated them and how the system as a whole treated them. I think that experience had a lot to do with the emphasis both in the original 10-point program and the explicit guarantee in the revised 10-point program of healthcare, free healthcare for Blacks and all oppressed people, healthcare that would be make use of the very best of post-racial modernist medicine, and that would take account of the roots of people's illness in systemic racism. If you just read the provision on healthcare in that revised Panthers platform, you get a sense of, what was behind their seizing upon healthcare in that revised platform. The initial platform didn't mention healthcare. It was Second Amendment to protect us from police brutality and a litany of other needs that would be realized against the state or collaboratively. But by 1972, when the local, after through an assault by the government, the local programs were losing membership, they really turned to healthcare as a major feature of their platform. And they emphasized the provision of these people's free health clinics. Those had already been mandated, but they came back, emphasized them, had a huge rally, open air rally in Oakland with 10,000 people there to launch, in part, their multi-pillared health campaign. And I think it's striking that of the three major pillars of their health campaign, one was to completely debunk and reframe what had then been completely racialized health scientism, health knowledge. And they did that primarily through the sickle cell campaign, among other campaigns, where they simply rewrote the medical science of sickle cell and used that as a frame for demanding a variety of treatments and research and testing for sickle cell. The other thing is they just went head on against the apartheid health system, the abusive apartheid health system that Johanna has referenced a little bit, not just the health deserts, but a face-to-face encounter with the microaggressions by sending in people to accompany people who went into the hospitals to do mapping and monitoring of these microabuses and to surface them and put them together systemically. And the third pillar was what, to me, in terms of empowerment, I find particularly important, was these free medical clinics, which had a number of features that were explicitly designed to be prefigurative in the very best sense, both to empower all the participants in them to debunk hierarchy, to reclaim medical knowledge, and to look toward prefigured medical system in the future. What they didn't do much of was to think about bureaucracy. They embraced the need for tertiary medical care in a transformed society, but they said very little, if anything. I haven't been able to find anything about exactly how that tertiary care would be organized. Nothing I can find about democratic experimentalism inside bureaucracy. So I think that's a piece of a challenge that needs to build from this groundwork of these prefigured local health centers for the future.
Thanks, Lucie. Maya?
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here. And it's already, I'm buzzing already with the comments already. So I want to talk a little bit about the Grey Panthers today, and because for plenty of reasons we can discuss further, I imagine that many of you don't have a sense of who the Grey Panthers are or what they are, and it's sort of like already, you know, there's the like, oh, there's the name, there's all of this. So I thought I'd give a little background just on who they are and how they get to health, and go from there. So the Grey Panthers are an intergenerational activist group. They emerge in 1970s Philadelphia, and their constituencies and tactics differ pretty significantly from the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. Like, there's a reason these two are grouped together in a way that the Grey Panthers aren't. But they do share some similar aims, and they collaborate pretty widely with this sort of landscape of social movement activists that I imagine all of you are familiar with. The Grey Panthers' access to Medicare in particular, along with their efforts to demystify their own aging bodies, really did lead them to center health activism in their work. And as a sort of largely white, middle-class, elderly group, as they sought to advance health reform, their fluency and familiarity with bureaucracy and various bureaucracies that they had engaged with in their professional lives made partnerships with local governments and regulatory bodies a kind of easier choice for them. And I think, you know, to what Lucie was just saying at the end of her comments, they had sort of the opposite thing. They were really interested in, like, how can we play around with the forms of these bureaucracies as they exist? And they worked really hard to equip their members with those tools. So the Grey Panthers, as they got started, they rallied under the slogan of Age and Youth in Action. They called for an expanded role for elderly people in public life. They pushed back on theories of aging that normalized disengagement and the gradual decline of the elderly, and anything that relegated them to the social and political margins. They had been really energized by the social movements of the 1960s, and of which many members of the Grey Panthers had been really actively involved. And in fact, their sort of founding act as an organization was to take a really strong stance against the Vietnam War, which they felt they had been told that that was a young people's problem. And they in fact wanted to say that this was everyone's problem. And in that same way, they emphasized coalition building really strongly from the beginning and explicitly rejected what they called the me firstism of other senior advocacy organizations. So that's sort of the milieu they're coming out of. And I want to also just emphasize two other quick points about this kind of moment of their founding. The first is personal. Maggie Kuhn, who's this very iconic founder of the Grey Panthers, turned 65 in 1970, and she found herself facing mandatory retirement after a lengthy career in the Social Education and Action Division of the Presbyterian Church. She all of a sudden felt cast off and ignored, as if her years of experience had been meaningless. And she also felt that if she did want to stay involved, she was supposed to deny that she was aging at all. And this confluence of factors for her also reflected her particular privileges. She was a middle-class white woman retiring from a stable career in a white-collar job, and she felt newly disenfranchised. And I think this sort of undergirds a lot of the Grey Panther strategies in terms of understanding their efforts as a way to regain or expand the rights of citizenship and representation as opposed to achieve them for the first time. And then lastly, this other piece of context, I think, is that throughout the 1960s, public and political discourse had been totally consumed with concern about the rapidly growing elder population. And this propelled Congress toward the establishment of the White House Conference on Aging, a permanent Senate Special Committee on Aging, lots of funding for individual local programs. But even as all this attention was devoted to aging people themselves had really been sidelined in the development and implementation of those programs. And all of this is happening in a world that had been remade by Medicare. And I think in the same way that Johanna was talking about access to Medicaid, just opening up the world of contact between people of color and poor people and physicians and hospitals, you see a similar thing happening with elderly people, many of whom had previously been trapped in really grinding poverty. And having access to the services of Medicare massively lifted these material circumstances, and it increases their capacity. They have more time, more financial resources, and for some, more physical mobility, decrease in pain that can be managed by regular medical care. And this in turn allows increased participation in programs or in organizations like the Grey Panthers or anything else in their communities that they might want to devote their time to. And so I think in this really foundational way, the Grey Panthers understand that mobilization around healthcare is kind of vital for any kind of long-term political power building among the elderly. That being said, they don't see Medicare as a silver bullet. They're very attuned to it as a piecemeal solution that in fact dampened efforts to fully overhaul the US healthcare system. And in addition, they're very resentful of Medicare's focus on acute care and intensive treatment, as opposed to supportive and preventive care that allows people to remain in their own communities and within existing networks of informal care, as well as the sort of focus on cure alone, particularly for people who are suffering from chronic illnesses. So for these reasons, the Grey Panthers have a long time collaboration with both the Medical Committee for Human Rights and Health PAC to call not only for investment in universal single payer health insurance, but also for the development of a national health service based in local preventative care clinics. Let's see. And I'll just super briefly touch on two other sort of local level examples that I'm sure we can come back to when we talk more, but just to get a sense of how they're thinking about their role within existing bureaucracies. So one is in Philadelphia, the first project they undertake as an organization really as such is to investigate the local nursing home industry. This culminates in a work called the Nursing Home Citizens Action Guide, which is published first as a report, in building off of work done by the National Welfare Rights Organization and the Young Lords to argue for a patient's Bill of Rights. They develop a resident's Bill of Rights and demand resident representation on nursing home boards. And in this kind of completed report, what they offer is a real step-by-step instruction manual for individual people to join together and start making these demands of the nursing homes and the nursing home regulatory industry or nursing home regulatory agencies in the places that they live. So in this way, organizing around healthcare is given this sort of step-by-step manual treatment as a way to draw people in and take these sort of small, empowering steps to understand the bureaucracy as transparent. And then the second, keeping an eye on time, but the second quick example I'll mention here too is in Berkeley, California, the East Bay Grey Panthers make a sort of rare move for the Grey Panthers overall and dive into direct service provision by opening their own health clinic. Again, because many of the Berkeley Grey Panthers have their own experience in administrative and helping professions, they are personally familiar with many public servants in the city, and they see the city as like less of an adversary and more as a potential partner in furthering their aims. So they're able to utilize public funding and set up a collaboration with the local health department to establish a preventive care clinic. And what I think is really fascinating there is that they have this sort of fluency and ease with the bureaucracy, but they work really hard to insulate their clients from it. So using their facility with these contracts, they're able to sort of play with the language in order to prevent the means testing that the city wanted, to prevent patients from needing to give their addresses to determine geographic eligibility. And they don't need to sort them in any way based on whether the needs that brought them to the clinic are medical or non-medical, which might include something like toenail clipping or talking about grief and loss of a family member. And so once this program is up and running, the clinic is really lauded for these sort of soft things, the unrushed atmosphere, the patience and sensitivity, and those are seen as forms of care in and of themselves by the Grey Panthers. Those are real metrics by which a healthcare system should be judged. So just to close out here, but I think one thing I really grappled with in thinking about the Grey Panthers, particularly in relation to groups like the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, is that in many ways, these are not radical changes. These are these small carved out spaces within existing bureaucracies. And I think what's been exciting for me is to think about what new metrics or small spaces we can look to and sort of make visible from within that work. So I'm very excited to talk with you all. I'll leave it there.
So again, ask people to put questions into the chat. So I have I have lots of questions, but just one thing to say, you should pick up Johanna's book, because if you don't know about the Young Lords, you're going to get an education from Johanna in the book that's, again, won major history awards for telling this tale. If you're interested in the Black Panthers, Alondra Nelson has Body and Soul, which is...
Oh, really? It's fantastic.
Both books are fantastic. I've been reading both Alondra's book and Johanna's book over the past week. As I said, one of Amy and my course sessions this semester is going to focus on all three of these movements. So I have a question for Johanna, which is a little specific, and then I'll move to a more general one. One of the interesting things I learned about the Young Lords is their focus on reproductive rights and reproductive health, and particularly the support for abortion, which I had no idea of. And like, I'm not quite sure how that got integrated into the work of the Young Lords, and whether it shows up in other social movements of the time that are sort of not directly tied to the feminist movement in the US.
So what the question is, sorry.
Is the Young Lords and abortion and reproductive rights, and it becomes a part of their platform and part of what they talk about. And it seems very specific to the Young Lords. I don't know if the Panthers had the same kind of response to sort of the reproductive rights and reproductive health issues that were facing their members.
I think that there was conversation in the Black Panther Party about this. I think the Young Lords just concretized it with a public statement on the issue of women, reproductive rights, and liberation. Essentially, their critique, like the critique of the Black Panthers and others, was that the colonial project influences women and women's bodies in particular ways. So they address the issue of sterilization. And they condemn it in Puerto Rico, in hospitals across the United States, urban centers, but also in the South. And they say that the control of the bodies of women of color is just not an issue that white women confront, but it's specifically an issue connected to racism and the colonial project. You want to control women's bodies because you want to control the population of people of color. And so they supported abortion, but they were very interested in educating women around these issues of sterilization. And they believe that people of color, historically oppressed people of color in the United States, would experience a crisis of population, that the state wanted to contain these populations. And so women of color would have to take all of this into consideration when considering abortions. That was it. I think one of the central features of their program was this idea of preventative healthcare and door-to-door healthcare and education, public education. So they were concerned with educating women around pregnancy, contraception. They focused on the care of elderly people and children. And in many ways, they were taking a footnote from the project in Cuba. So they were inspired, like the Black Panthers, by the Cuban experiment with healthcare. And they called diseases that were prevalent in communities of color, diseases of poverty. High blood pressure, diabetes, tuberculosis, all of these were diseases of poverty and a product of being frontline workers and not having decent food in supermarkets, not having access to the land. This was not particular to the Young Lords. Fred Hampton did an enormous amount of work around these issues, around food and food consumption that seemed to be new, but the Black Panthers were close to or were talking about. And of course, because of women's oppression, these were also women's issues. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I wanted to quickly just let people know that the Young Lords are credited with the passage of anti-lead poisoning legislation in New York. They drafted the first known patient Bill of Rights. They occupied Lincoln Hospital, and they believed that you challenge bureaucracy, or bureaucracy is able to flourish because of lack of participation of ordinary people in their healthcare. So they argued that people should be educated around issues of health, and that the number of nurses and doctors and medical technicians should increase exponentially. I'll leave it there.
So, this is a question and anybody can answer it, but as I'm reading Alondra's book and reading Johanna's book, the template for what we need to do in health, these groups are pioneers in how we need to deal with health in the 21st century, but they disappear, right? And we know what's happened in our history since the 60s and 70s, but in a certain sense, there's a whole generation that does not even know about all this work and the sort of model it provides, not for like something 50 years ago, but something today. Amy and I have been talking about community health and building up community health. And when you read the Young Lords platform, the Patient's Bill of Rights, the stuff in Body and Soul, you realize we've been here before. This is like a naive, stupid question, but how does it disappear? How does it get disappeared into the historical record so that we have to resurrect it, on webinar now?
I think that's one of the most important issues to unpack not just, I don't think it's naive at all, but to really unpack the moves that were made in part by the US government and others to both vilify, in the case of the Panthers, to vilify them through very common stereotypes about violent macho Black men, to erase, to obstruct literally the clinics in a variety of ways, and then just to erase that history from the dominant cultures, like white cultures' imagination. I think that just the moves that were made to accomplish that really have to be unearthed. The whole experience is being resurrected now, at least for progressive people and liberal people. So you go on the web, there are hundreds of photographs now about the Panthers' health work. There was a journal of the American Public Health Association devoted to it. So it's really become mainstream, trying to get it back into the discussion. But how exactly it got erased, I think it's really important for us to understand that.
And if I can jump in for a second, I think one thing I've thought a lot about studying this group of elderly activists, many of whom are living with chronic illnesses and other kinds of debility, so much of their work was to surface what was happening in these isolated institutions because it was so easy to hide them again from public view. And also, I think often about the early years of the Grey Panthers, a number of the founding members died within a couple of years of them getting off the ground. And I think a lot about their investment in these written manuals and these, writing things down and making rules, and that was also a form of an effort at institutional memory building because so many of them were in fact dying so soon after they had kind of set this activism in motion. And I think that is something that they really grappled with as people living with chronic illness at that time. And then the other thing I just say, and kind of specific, I guess, in this, well, I don't know how specific it is, but certainly for the Grey Panthers, because of their belief and willingness to partner with municipal governments, particularly in the case of California, you can track really quickly how their more innovative and I think radical ideas are so dampened, specifically in 1978 with the passage of Prop 13, California's tax base just, poof, there's all your money for something like an innovative clinic. And what you see is as activists sort of are thrown back against the ropes, they're able to have the kind of skeleton of that clinic survive, but those sort of small creative ways of, having additional volunteers to help take more time for appointments and make patients more comfortable, those are the first things to go. So I think we can kind of trace some of the erasure there as well.
Just as Maya's talking, it strikes me that particularly looking at this Journal of the American Public Health Association, that the picture of the health clinics that's being resurfaced and mainstreamed teases out what were really the most politically important features of the clinic's design and the clinic's practice. I think the most radical features, if I can say that, and focuses more on the ways that empowering people to learn about their own health conditions and be partners in their own treatment can be used to create better health outcomes.
What I'm thinking about very quickly is the demystification of medicine, the democratization of access to education is central to the work that these groups are doing. But part of what they're arguing is that medicine should not be a for-profit venture. And if it's a for-profit venture, corporations are going to take over, and specialization and this focus on technology is going to essentially determine what hospitals look like and what service they provide to the community. They also argue that healthcare workers have a very special place in society because they're connected to labor, to the labor force and the working class, but also to the community. Very, very few workers are interested both in wages and conditions, but also the conditions of the community. And they argued that healthcare workers are in this very critical place, and they are able to keep their eyes on both these labor interests and community interests. And so they believed that organizing this force was important. And what ends up happening, I think, the Young Lords organized in hospitals, is that repression comes down. So in the 1960s, you could go into a hospital and there weren't police officers and security around. But now, especially in New York City, part of what we see is the securitization of hospitals, but also the building of police departments in hospitals themselves, the public hospitals in New York City. So all of the hospitals that are public in New York have a police department in it or adjacent to it. And I haven't done the work, but that is a product, I think. I haven't really looked deeply into this, but this emerges certainly after the 60s. And my sense is that it is a way to control this industry, which is central to the American economy, right, to urban economies. That's just one thought, that repression is one of the ways that that this history is erased.
So this is a good segue into a question. We have two questions that are related to each other that talks about repression. It says, Jesse Montgomery asks, how did repression help shape the group's ideological positions on healthcare as resistance survival? And then Russell Thomas jumps in and says, I'm curious about how we can think about health organizing temporarily as the police state has expanded since this period. So how did repression and function during the sort of era of the Young Lords and the Black Panthers? But when we're thinking about healthcare organizing now, in the context of what Johanna, you've just said, how do we think about organizing as a police state has expanded rapidly since those years? And anybody can jump in.
There were so many vectors of repression, it's hard to even respond or to kind of begin the response. I know the ones that come to mind with respect to the Panthers is there were multiple forms of repression to just get the clinics to stop operating. From the police just blocking them in Los Angeles, to multiple ways that municipal regulations would be changed to make it illegal in various ways for the Panthers to do some of the kind of health delivery, or their doctors to do some of the kind of health delivery that we're doing. So there were all of the, I don't want to call them micro repressions, but multiple repressions to just dislodge their health provision that they were seeking to do. There was, of course, were various types of undermining and repression of the public health facilities to which the people in the communities were being triaged by the clinics. But there also was just the assault on the Panthers was so violent by the US government and the police, that there were a lot of just literally wounded people who had to be cared for, and who were going to meet with the kind of repression that Johanna is talking about in the public health system, not to mention the carceral system. So the question I am faced with was, how did the Panthers system of clinics last and really flourish as long as it did, the 16 or so clinics across the country, up until the mid or to late 70s, in the face of all these different kinds of repression? I think that's a lesson to really be learned from this.
So I'm going to read another question from Bree Muller, who's our GHJP fellow, and she's saying the Grey Panthers seem to embrace health bureaucracy and the government's role in healthcare. The Young Lords seem to engage in efforts like Lincoln Hospital and the garbage offensive to provoke local government into action. And an anarchic reading of the People's Free Clinics might suggest that the Black Panthers were building a people-led alternative to the state's role in care. As in the panelist view, which the question is for all of you, how do you think these different strategies might fit in today's context of government inaction with COVID-19? We're in the middle of a pandemic, and there are three competing models, not mutually exclusively described here, but what lessons do the Young Lords, the Great Black Panthers, and the Grey Panthers offer towards how we think about dealing with the COVID pandemic and sort of broadly the histories of the contemporary sort of health disparities we're facing, all these years later?
I'll say that the Chicago Young Lords, they ran a very successful clinic, and I think the question of how do you do that? How did the Black Panthers run 17 clinics for so long successfully? And you have to say that health care is important, and people need to feel welcomed and safe when they are being treated medically. That is not a condition that people of color experienced in the 1960s. It took the 60s to civilize medical care, really, in this country. So, I mean, it's not yet, but it's a lot better than it was then. And so community support was critical to the functioning of these clinics. I will say this, that when the crisis detonated, the pandemic, I thought that if the Young Lords had been around, they would have held a series of competing press conferences, right? There were press conferences here in New York City held by the governor, and of course, 45 had all kinds of press conferences. The Young Lords used the media and knowledge and public education to educate people about health. For a very long time, it was unclear what was before us. And they didn't work alone, the Young Lords and the Black Panthers. They actually collaborated with radical doctors and nurses and technicians, and saw the power of these workers in action. And we got a sense of the power of doctors and nurses during the pandemic. Whenever they took action, the world listened. It seemed like New York City listened. And so there was a missed opportunity there in the absence of a radical left that might strategize to take the offensive, to put forth a solution. The actions of doctors and nurses and technicians were episodic, right? There was no clear focus. And what the Young Lords at least did was that they identified a problem and then organized a strategy to pressure government to deliver. And in the absence of that, they created services themselves. Now, I'll just end by saying that the creation of services, this idea of prefigurative politics, is tough because you have to sustain a clinic, and that really drains your energies for work long-term on a revolutionary project. So I'll leave it there, and maybe Lucie has something. It seems like you have
several thoughts, especially that the health system hasn't been transformed since 1960 as much as one would wish. But that said, I think one interesting thing about the way the Panthers aspired to have the clinics operate and occasionally pulled it off was that they would be platforms for radical political action of various kinds, both about healthcare and not about healthcare, at the same time that they were prefiguratively delivering services, turning doctors into trusted experts, et cetera. And I think the best example of that I'm aware of anyway, of this model being carried forward is in the very early worker centers of Jennifer Gordon, for instance, in which people were drawn in to, in a way that their kind of immediate reality was being addressed collaboratively. But there also were very explicitly being drawn into political education, to political action of all kinds. And in the clinics, for instance, the volunteer radical doctors, medical students, lab technicians, whoever could be recruited, had to sit in study groups to read Fanon, to read Mao, to read Che Guevara, sometimes to memorize them, to think about how the action of the health clinics would be action toward revolution in a very definite way, not an abstract way, practice toward revolution. So that's one thing that I think is important to recognize about kind of their very explicit model for the clinic and the practice in various places. With respect to the pandemic, I think a really good example of what one can learn from the Panthers, and it picks right up on what Johanna was talking about, is their work on the sickle cell campaign, which both involved massive testing by lay workers and training lay workers to test people in communities, education, media work, collaboration with medical associations, very high profile media work, national TV, to reframe understandings of sickle cell, so not a reflection of Black inferiority, to lobby for national legislation for more research, more support, treatment for the syndrome, and other forms of reform, frankly, that would also reframe understandings and kind of recapture and push back against racist scientific understandings. I think with respect to the pandemic, the big misstep of a radical coalition like that in the early stages of the pandemic was not to double down on the, I was talking to Gregg about this before, the fact that in the very early stage, low-wage workers were forced to stay at work. And the huge discrepancy between the Black and white death rate in the pandemic across the board was in part because these people were going to work in these meat packing plants, chicken packing plants, construction, you name it, at the height of the pandemic. And the OSHA provision permitted it. There was no focus on it among fellow traveler radical doctors, nurses, intellectuals, nearly to the degree that there should have been. And I think, that could have happened. It happened to some degree. It should have happened much more widely.
Maya, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just for a second. I think two things sort of jump to mind. And the first is the first kind of relevant point I think that the Grey Panthers would have championed really quite strongly is very clearly linking the well-being of patients and of healthcare workers. And, in the COVID case, we can look either at hospitals or nursing homes, particularly where we saw incredible mortality of both residents and healthcare workers in these settings where there wasn't adequate PPE for so long and the labor conditions have just been really atrocious. And I think in particular for the kinds of healthcare work that are not, physicians, but thinking about CNAs or techs, folks who do not have the prestige associated with being a medical doctor. I think the Grey Panthers were quite clear early on that they had common cause. And so that, and I think that, we were talking about do people listen when healthcare providers talk? And I think the answer is like some kinds of healthcare providers. And I think the Grey Panthers did really powerful work of connecting that in order for them to be well, the people who worked in healthcare settings also needed to be able to be well. So that's one piece. And then I think the other thing that comes to mind is, again, the Grey Panther emphasis on preventative, local, supportive care. They were very concerned about the technological emphasis of American medicine and the profit motive behind that. And I think about that in the kind of, particularly as we think about, the investment that would be required to help people stay home as opposed to the investment required to intubate someone in an ICU. And I think, again, because of the Grey Panthers' real emphasis on keeping people in their communities and embedded in places where they actually are doing really meaningful work to take care of themselves and each other, that is where government investment should be directed first and foremost in thinking about what a public healthcare system looks like. And I think certainly that's a lesson that, hasn't been learned or put into practice uniformly over the course of this pandemic.
So we have until, I think until 5:15. So I want to pivot it to the current moment. And there's a lot of stuff in the chat, but I remember in the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests that erupted all over the country. There was a really swift reaction when public health experts and clinicians signed on to a letter, thousands of them, in support of Black Lives Matter and their faculty members at Yale who remain nameless, and other sort of pundits who said keeping Black Lives Matter and the fight against the pandemic separate were really important to protect the credibility of public health. But as I'm looking through the chat, I'm seeing people talking about how do we get the police out of hospitals? From Ayanna Jordan, a friend of mine who used to be at Yale, but now is at NYU. People talking about the sort of current politics around race in the United States and health disparities. What are the opportunities politically from your minds about how to sort of integrate sort of the fight for racial justice and Black Lives Matter into the health movements that are sort of still around and still willing to address sort of the more health specific issues? I mean, Johanna, maybe you could think about like, how do we build those coalitions? How do we get police out of the hospitals if we were going to talk about one issue, but a whole sort of range of issues to confront? I
mean, I think, again, public education is critical. Folks probably don't know or haven't made the connection that hospitals are replete with police corps, like army of police officers. In New York City, when you call 911 because you're ill, a cop comes alongside of the EMT. So part of what we see is the expansion of police power, these services that should be exclusively performed by medical people. Cops are involved. Just making people aware of that, I think, is important. And educating people around the fact that racism is a public health crisis that affects both people of color and white people alike, right? Not equally, but all of American society is affected by this. I think that there was a radicalization process that happened during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, at the height of the pandemic. But that went nowhere because there wasn't an explicit, ultimately revolutionary politic making the connections and exploring coalition. The Young Lords and the Black Panthers, they didn't think up these things. There was an enormous amount of reading. People traveled to Cuba to figure out what the healthcare system looked like in Cuba and what we might be able to replicate in communities like East Harlem with this door-to-door preventative health care. So I think we need to dream big dreams. One of the big, I think something to learn from the 60s and from the Black Panthers and the Young Lords is something that was mentioned earlier, which is that ordinary people have the capacity to do technical and big things. It's the sense that that we can do it, and professionalization is not necessary to make an intervention, an epic intervention in society.
I'll just say that Angela Harris is in the chat saying, oftentimes we're the answers we're looking for and we can't rely on systems and government for the answers. I mean, lots of the mutual aid that happened during COVID-19, Angela says, took playbooks out of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords to serve under marginalized communities of color, et cetera. So like, I think you're right, Johanna. Anybody else want to leap in here?
The only thing, I want to go back, Gregg, to your comment early on about erasure of moments or movements we could learn from. And I wonder how much of the really interesting work that was done by the various movements for Black lives after and during the very recent mobilizations, activity around health perhaps has been either erased or lost, and how much of that is still going on. I've just been wondering about that because I know there's so many different local organizations that are working on developing different kinds of service delivery type projects or working around different issues. And I feel like that there may be more to build on from recently as well as from 40, 50 years ago, and we need to put the two together. I mean, the other thing I want to just emphasize about certainly the Panthers went to China, they went to Cuba, they read Guevara and Fanon and Mao about how to critique the racist origins of illness and how to structure emancipatory health care. And we should be reading them for their health insights now. And also reading what the people who've been involved at the grassroots and movements more recently have been doing and thinking about.
Just one more thought that comes to mind here. I think, I'm not sure if this is an exact answer to the question, certainly, but I think about movements like Black Lives Matter as being models for just thinking collectively. Like, this seems like something that when we're talking about kind of how to reinvigorate health activism in some way, I think something that's really core to each of these groups is this idea of health as a collective endeavor rather than an individual one. Certainly something rooted in people's very individual bodily experiences, but this idea that, you know, for the Black Panthers, like being well for the revolution, but also being well for one another, that it is your duty and obligation to be a part of your community and to take care of yourself so that you're also able to care for each other in these larger fights. And I think we can, again, look at the uprisings last summer and think about what it looks like to link together in some way to think about the fate of our healthcare system as being a collective obligation and duty to fix, to prefigure something different.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of chat going on in the chat and the Q&A about there's a worker protection action on February 9th. There's a whole bunch of actions that people are asking people on this call to be part of. You should take a look at the chat and cut and paste so you can be part of them, to try to support groups that are doing the work now on the front lines. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left until 5:15. I wanted to give Johanna, Lucie, and Maya a chance to sort of leave us with some closing remarks about sort of where we go next. And I mean, some of it's looking backwards, but hopefully thinking about moving forward. We're not out of this pandemic yet. And, you know, Amy and I are trying to sort of think together with our class and think together ourselves about what the future holds. And just would like to draw you out on where you see the possibilities for a new revolutionary movement, or at least some movement in that direction.
Well, as folks were talking, I'm thinking that part of what happened in the past and happened during this moment of Black Lives Matter at the height of the pandemic was that a culture of resistance was built, right? That's not easy, but what are the elements of this culture of resistance? First, we need an analysis. Part of what the Young Lords and the Black Panthers did was that they had an analysis. What are the root causes of this health crisis? Healthcare for profit, the colonial project, racism, capitalism produces illness. The environmental crisis is a product of capitalist waste combined with racism, epic crisis, right? You need an analysis and root causes. Part of what the Young Lords did was that they engaged in militant action that stopped the city in its tracks. A hospital was occupied. The drama of that gets a conversation going in public, in the public square. You need that. You need a strategy. You need education. You need to read. There are also alternatives. One of the things that the Young Lords did was that they built a clinic that used acupuncture to treat addiction. That was a faux pas. The medical profession did not accept that. It's now accepted. I heard from an alternative medicine doctor that a group of alternative medicine doctors met with the governor of New York to talk about how to stem death in the middle of the pandemic. What strategies to use that were being used in China and Cuba And the governor said, thank you, but no, thank you. So I think that we need the different elements of this conversation through the different elements to build a culture and a standard for what we mean by liberated healthcare. It has to begin with healthcare is what brings us together, and it speaks to our common humanity. We need it to survive. It should not be for profit. I mean, very basic things that need to be amplified in art, in schools, everywhere. That's what I can contribute to this conversation for now. Culture of resistance around issues of health.
Lucie, do you want to jump in?
Thank you. That was inspiring. The Panthers did so many things. They were phenomenal at kind of debunking scientific, modernist, racist health knowledge, quote unquote, without throwing out the baby with the bathwater, claiming and reclaiming and reframing modernist health knowledge so it could enhance well-being and combine with the kinds of alternative treatments that Johanna is talking about. But what I'm really stuck on, and I'll just flag it, is, yes, we have to decarceralize health bureaucracies. We have to work in tandem with health workers who are both community people and health workers. But somehow those emphases seem to leave out the challenge of, and we have to recruit both lay people, community members, people in need of health care, along with trusted experts of all kinds to join together. But it seems like all of that side steps kind of does an end run around the challenge of, I don't want to use the term levels, but the ways that a transformed health system could be configured so that every dimension of it would work in deeply democratic, non-hierarchical, non-exploitative ways. I just don't think we've done the kind of, or we've engaged in community in thinking in visionary ways about, but also grounded ways about what transformation of health systems would look like. And I think we've obsessed about the prefigurative design of these micro clinics and sidestep the harder systemic issue. What would a kind of post-racialized transformative health system that would provide whatever transformed tertiary care would look like without it being technological? I mean, what would that look like? That's what I'm stuck with.
Maya?
Yeah, I think maybe this is a fitting segue, but I think one thing that the Grey Panthers and certainly the Young Lords and the Black Panthers also considered was decoupling the value of health from capitalist productivity, right? So the point of health is not, for these activists, is not to be well enough to go to work. And I think very often, whether it is explicit or implicit, that is the goal of a for-profit healthcare system as it exists today. And we can certainly think about, the ways that, I mean, thinking just now of the CDC, shortening quarantine to 5 days, right? Like that whole debacle, where you can see the really close interweaving of these systems. And so if the question is, where do we go next? I think, certainly, sadly, not getting down to the nitty gritty of like, here's how you do it. But one thing I've been thinking about quite a bit is, how do you define what health is for if you take away the sort of implied base that we're sort of steeped in? To use Johanna's language of culture of resistance, what is the culture of resistance pushing for? What is health for? What can you as a member of a collective use health for? And I think it's also, I want to caveat that before we go too, is just to say, like, I also, to be clear, and I think there's actually a comment in the Q&A about defining health, and I want to be really clear that I think there's a version of that that can become weird eugenics-y direction of like the aim is perfect health, and that is not what I'm shooting for, but just this sense of what is the meaning of having the care that you need? What does it allow you to do? And I think that was a question that the Grey Panthers worked really hard to try to answer for themselves outside the kind of demands and model of the existing healthcare system. So I think I'll leave it there.
So we're about 5 minutes over, but I could sit here and talk to these three people for a long time. But I wanted to thank Johanna, Lucie, and Maya for being with us today and kicking off our semester's first Law and Political Economy and GHJP seminar on the politics of care. We have another, when is our next one popping up? I think in March. Do we know?
March 3rd.
March 3rd. And we'll send out that to everybody who's interested through the LPE and the GHJP list, and we'll put it everywhere else we can find it. I'm looking for that revolutionary moment and the chance to build a culture of resistance. And I think it's part of an ongoing conversation we need to have. And how do we transform the very systems of care that we depend on, which have been basically taken over just to get us back to work. Thank you three so much for doing this. We know you're really busy. You have lots of people begging for your time, but it was just a great event. And thank you again for being with us.
Guys.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.